us.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you, Chris, and welcome to early winter at the J.C. Ralston Arboretum. Every gardener at some point has said, you should have seen my garden last week. Well, last week with the 10 days or so of 70-degree weather, our Arboretum was absolutely full of bloom. But our focus today are the subtler beauties of the winter landscape. And a lot of the things that were in full bloom last week are a little bedraggled because we went down to, I don't know, about 28 or so a couple nights ago. But what might have hurt some of the bloomy things even more was more than 4 inches of very hard rain with very strong wind. But there is so much beauty in the winter garden. And in this warm end of Zone 7, we have an absolute wealth of evergreens. And evergreen is just a descriptive term. It's not a classification. But both broadleafed evergreens and needled evergreens, the conifers. And they are not our focus today, but I think they really set off the deciduous trees and shrubs that have their own beauty this time of year. And if we look at the big view beyond me, you see the cinnamon red bark of a Japanese crepe myrtle, Lagerstromia forii. That's an arboretum named clone called Fantasy. And beyond that, you see a bit of bloom on 2 camellias, some red, some white, and other broadleafed evergreens there. And then in the far distance, the great, bold architecture of a huge willow oak against the silvery sky on a overcast winter day. And standing here, I saw something that startled me. And it's perhaps a little off topic, but underneath these fronds of this queen sago, it's one of our native trilliums. It's Trillium maculatum, maculatum meaning spotted. And so many of these sessile trilliums do have spotted leaves. And it's not unusual to see them up this time of year. A lot of our native woodland plants come into growth early because they make use of the sun that's accessible when the leaves are off the trees in the woodland. And they're amazingly frost hardy. They'll survive the coldest weather we have in the winter. You can see, I'm sure most people know trilliums are trilliums because they have 3 leaflets, and when the flower bud opens, it'll have 3 sepals and 3 petals, so everything's in 3s. One other little plant of winter interest is this little hydrangea relative. It's Dichroa, little evergreen relative of hydrangea. In bloom, it's much like a little wild lace cap hydrangea, not tremendously showy, but really the reason to grow it is for these cobalt blue fruit, which will last all winter. The Dichroa that one encounters most often is Dichroa febrifuga. And if you have a medical or a background, you probably know that a febrifuge is something that alleviates fevers. And it's one of the most important medicinal plants in Asia. But here we grow it as an ornamental. And this is a dwarf selection. I see that we haven't yet determined exactly which species it is, but it's very much like the other Dichroa febrifuga that we grow in the Arboretum. The full-size plants are 3 to 5 feet tall. References say they can get up to 8 foot tall, but a real beauty in the winter garden. I think we'll head this way and see a couple other plants of winter interest. Some of the plants that are grown for their distinct growth habits such as weeping plants or columnar plants or plants with contorted twigs, I think are even showier in the winter when their branching structure is not hidden by leaves. And this is a modern selection of a contorted hazel, a corylus. This is not the common Harry Lauder's walking stick, but a purple foliage selection. And I'm going to have to step to the other side and find out the name. But
is that Red Majestic?
Yes, Red Majestic. You see the stems are sort of twist this way and that, but we also have a subtle feature this time of year that I quite enjoy. These are these long catkins are the male flowers, and they're not going to bloom until late winter, but they're present on the shrub all winter. And the female flowers are tiny, but the wind pollinated like many, like oaks and many other trees as well. But a real interesting plant in the winter landscape. Have a witch hazel here that's not quite yet open. It's a little early for a lot of witch hazels, but they'll be out soon. A plant I really enjoy are the coral berries or Indian currants. Our native coral berry, well, they're all Sephora carpus, long generic name. And our native one is Sephora carpus orbiculatus. And it looks much like this, but this is a hybrid between our native species and probably Sephora carpus alba, which has big white berries. But a nice aspect of this fruit display is that it persists all winter long. I don't notice the birds ever harvesting these fruit, so they do persist all winter and they're not hurt by freezing weather. It is a suckering or spreading shrub, so it's great if you have a lot of territory to cover. And though I really like the plant, it's not one I can recommend for a small yard because it does have this strongly spreading habit. But if you had a big bank or something, it's a great plant for that kind of use. I was surprised by the Trillium being up already. Now, only because I hadn't seen it before. It's not unusual for them to be up this early, but this is another native woodland plant that is dormant in the summer but comes up in the fall and has foliage all winter long. It's toothwort, which is dentaria. Dentaria as in tooth, or the same root as the word dentist. And it's Dentaria trifoliata. You see the leaf is divided into three. Nice purple underside to the leaf. And the pale veins in the leaves add quite a bit of interest. It's the same family, the cruciferae family, the mustard family, as the collards you ate for New Year's. Pretty different from collards and stuff, but it has that typical four-petaled flowers that give the cruciferae family or it's now the Brassicaceae, I guess. But give the family its name. The same root as crucifix, the cross-like arrangement of four petals. Great little plant to plant under deciduous shrubs, where when it disappears in the summer, you don't notice that it's gone. And then when the shrubs are leafless in the fall and all winter long, the foliage carpets the ground. Its rate of spread is fairly modest. This must have been a lot that was planted here at some point. We'll see some of these plants up close, but in the distance you can see a willow with its brightly colored twigs. And, it's sort of played up against the blue Colorado spruce. The two set each other off. But a lot of, most trees and stuff have very distinct outlines. And as you become more familiar with them, you you know, you can distinguish one from the other based on their architecture and silhouette. This is a, you know, half-sized bald cypress. You notice the cones on it as well. This willow selection is named Flame. And I think in a colder climate, it gets absolutely brilliant, sort of coral red. And this is a little bit more brightly colored on the sunny side of it. This is the north side of the plant. And if you're placing plants with colored twigs in your garden, the best place to site them is where they're viewed with the sun shining on them, because they're opaque. If you had something like a witch hazel with rusty orange or red flowers, those really pop if they're lit by the sun from behind, sort of like stained glass windows really come alive when the sun is shining through them. You see it's growing from a very large base. We cut it back hard every spring or late winter and let it regrow. This same kind of coppicing is done for producing long wands of new growth for basket making. So all of these brightly colored twigs were produced since it was cut down, early in the spring in 2021. So this is all new growth, and the new growth is going to have the brightest colored foliage. Nowadays, there are so many plants with, the typical upright growth habit have weeping selections, and this is a weeping form of eastern redbud. Years ago, nobody ever saw a weeping redbud, and then a few were found, and breeders such as Dr. Denny Werner here at NC State, using those weeping redbuds, cross them with ones with colorful foliage. And this is a selection Dr. Werner introduced Ruby Falls with bright burgundy foliage, but with this very pendant growth habit. And he also more recently introduced Golden Falls, which has bright yellow foliage with this same habit. And there's variegated ones with weeping habit, and the new introduction, Flamethrower, will soon be released in a weeping form. Flamethrower was introduced in 2020 or 2021, and it got the highest awarded plant at the Chelsea Flower Show last year, which is really an honor. But again, I think their weeping habit is most striking in the winter when they're without foliage. One of the signature plants here at the J.C. Ralston Arboretum is this weeping form of our native winged elm. The cultivar is Lace Parasol, and you can see why it's called the winged elm, because the bark have these quirky ridges on the stem, giving it that winged characteristic. Now, the original plant was found, I believe, in Chatham County, North Carolina, and was transplanted to the Arboretum decades ago. And unfortunately, about 4 years ago, it died of Dutch elm disease. And if you visited the Arboretum, in 2018, 19, and 20, you probably saw its trunk of the dead winged elm painted bright blue. But this is a younger plant that was planted, I think, in 2019. And it has taken off and is starting to really develop a nice habit. See, a very strongly weeping habit. This is not one of the large flowered fancy hybrids, but this is the Ozark witch hazel, a native witch hazel. And it's sort of the petals are sort of pale yellowish, and the center of the flower is reddish, and it's quite fragrant. And at this moment, it is being backlit by the sun, which sort of makes the flowers even more visible. It's actually a named cultivar. Oh, it's one of those modern cultivar names that you really can't pronounce. Klmneteen. The trademark name is Autumn Embers. But a selection of a native witch hazel. Here's a nice branch on it. And they'll bloom for many, many weeks this time of year, maybe even more than a month. And these flowers are not hurt by the cold, as so many winter flowering things are. If it turns really cold, the petals will curl up, but then they're not hurt by the cold. They'll, open back up after when the weather warms up again. This is a very tightly columnar pear. It actually produces some fruit. I wonder if it needs something to cross-pollinate it. It has the trademark name of Javelin. It's one of, I assume it's one of Dr. Tom Rainey's introductions. He tends to give them cultivars starting with NC, and then this is NCPX1 was the actual cultivar name of this plant. But again, the trademark name is Javelin. A lot of columnar plants are columnar when they're young, but then suffer from middle age spread as they get older and end up not being very columnar. But this is so strongly columnar. And the foliage has always been clean through the summer. We haven't seen any fire blight on it, which can be a problem with the culinary pears. And the fruit, when it's had some, are about the size of a Seckel pear, but very edible. But a interesting architecture in the garden this time of year. Now, I've been pointing out a lot of deciduous plants with very distinct growth habits, whether it's weeping or contorted or columnar, but the majority of deciduous plants have really beautiful architecture. This is a deciduous magnolia, a saucer-type magnolia, a late blooming one with sort of coral pink flowers. The cultivar is Coral Lake, but I enjoy the way it looks this time of year, the sort of arching outward and upward branching structure, and the buds, the terminal flower buds aren't terribly big, but they are fairly green. I think a lot of time seeing the beauty that is in front of our eyes just requires that we take the time to slow down and actually open our eyes and look at it. We tend to be sometimes, focused just on the showiest things, the brightly colored flowers, the large flowers, and we fail to see these more subtle beauties of things when they're not in bloom. I'm stopping here and I'm sputtering because I'm sort of almost speechless. But if you just sort of pan through this area, again, we have a lot of evergreen things setting things off. But if you look at this good-sized tree here with the sort of very vase-shaped upright growth habit, that's a Zelkova, a Japanese Zelkova. It's closely related to elm, but they typically have that very dense branching habit down low. God forbid you're a person who's totally obsessed with training every tree to a single main trunk, because I don't know if you'd ever succeed with a Zelkova, because their natural growth habit is so different from that. Beyond that, there's a weeping form of Prunus mume. You looked a little bit of white. It was in full bloom late last week, and it'll be back in bloom again. A lot of the winter flowering trees and shrubs have a huge number of flower buds. So the open flowers get destroyed by cold, but the unopened buds will open once there's a mild spell. But then there's, all this beautiful architecture of yuccas and agaves and some of their other relatives. There's just so much beauty in the garden, any garden this time of year, even if there's nothing in bloom. One of my favorite deciduous shrubs in the wintertime is this weeping form of the desert olive. The genus is Forestiera, named after somebody with Forestiera as their family name. And this is Forestiera angustifolia, meaning narrow leaf, and you see the leaf is narrow. There are other species of Forestieras that are native to the southeast U.S. And one of their common names is swamp privet and stuff like that. And they are related to privet. The common name of this species is desert olive, and all of those, privet and this genus, are in the olive family, along with other things like forsythia. And so this is a weeping form. So I've never seen the non-weeping form, which I guess is just a tall, upright growing shrub. And this is handsome enough through the winter, but its growth habit is so evident this time of year. And the pale gray barks look almost silvery when the sun is shining on it. Really striking this time of year. This is, we just met the desert olive, which is native to the southwest U.S. This is another plant native to that area extending into Mexico. This is Ognandia speciosa meaning very showy, and it has the common name of Mexican Buckeye. And Chris, you had a different common name for it yesterday. Something Redbud?
I made the comment that I thought there was a common name even had Redbud in the name too.
Oh, okay.
Like Mexican Redbud or something like that. Or
the flowers aren't all that much like Buckeye, and they are sort of that purplish pink of Redbud, Cercis. I think the seeds are more like Buckeyes, but I think these almost black fruit hanging on the trees are interesting in the winter landscape. The seeds are quite a bit smaller than Buckeye, but fairly similar to Buckeye, glossy and with that big bald spot there. Now, they don't shrivel up real quickly. If you ever collect Buckeye seeds, you need to sow them almost right away, because within a week they're starting to shrivel and lose their viability. But these are still firm and glossy, so I know they'll still germinate. But a fun, it's not native to this area, but native to the southwest tree that you don't see in many gardens. Another plant or cultivar of a plant grown for its colorful twigs is this selection of Acer negundo, the box elder. Acer, of course, is maple. You can see still holding on to quite a few fruit on the tree, but the typical winged fruits of a maple. Though there are other plants that have similar fruit. This type of fruit is known as a samara. And I use fruit in the botanical sense of being the part of the plant that bears the seed. There's one seed inside these. And I'm sure they fly away, fairly nicely. The box elder is a medium-sized native tree. It's a very widespread native, certainly occurs in North Carolina, but is native, I believe, through much of northern North America, probably east of the Rockies. And the typical Acer negunda has green twigs. And the green twigs themselves are somewhat showy, but this bright yellow one is even showier. It's a selection. The plant was found by local nurseryman Pat McCracken, and he named it Winter Lightning because the yellow twigs is about as rare as winter lightning, or at least as rare as winter lightning used to be. But it's a good example where the newest stems are the most brightly colored. All these really bright stems were produced last growing season, and the previous year are this part of the stem down here. And as you go down further, the stem is no longer yellow, but has become corky, brown gray. And if it wasn't cut back at all, it would get at least 40 feet tall. And then you just have yellow tips on a fairly good sized tree. And so we do periodically cut it back really hard, even to the ground. And I certainly want to cut it back hard before spring so that, a year from now, it is almost entirely bright yellow stems. And it's been cut back hard several times. It would have left to its own devices have had one main trunk or maybe just a few, and you can see when it was cut back, it produced lots of stems. So, it's what if this was a crepe myrtle, we would call crepe murder. But I'm sorry, I feel comfortable with cutting these things back hard to produce, maximize the number of brightly colored stems. I've known people to do that with the colored stem Japanese maples as well, such as the coral bark Japanese maple. The best known one of those is the cultivar Sangokaku. But again, if you just leave the plant to grow, to its mature size, it's mostly, gray branches with little red tips way up high. So if you cut it back hard, you'll have these great, big, brightly colored stems. This is a tree that's common in big parts of China and other parts of Southeast Asia. Pteroceltis. The common name is blue sandalwood, but Pteroceltis are the winged hackberries. Celtis is the genus that hackberry belongs to, and ptero means winged. If you had biology in public school or maybe an entomology class, all the orders of insects end in Ptero, like the butterflies and moths are in the order Lepidoptera, ending with that ptero ending. And that always refers to wings. So these are the winged Celtis. And yesterday when this tour was in person, there was the question, well, what part of the plant is winged? And I didn't remember to look that up between then and now. So that'll have to wait for another day.
Well, we at least found the winged fruit on it.
Yeah, that's probably where it gets its named. It's in the Cannabaceae, and if you recognize, if you know the scientific, it's also a common name. The scientific name for marijuana is cannabis, so this is in the same family as cannabis, but in a different genus. And it's not the sandalwood that is so common in the perfume industry, but that's a different genus of plants. But it has this mottled bark. You see how it peels. This is not being unhealthy, but this is the natural habit of the plant for the bark to peel away in these very dramatic manner. There's another plant of this species in Asian Valley that has even more pronounced peeling bark than this one does. The seeds of this plant are used in the perfume industry, and the bark is used to make rice paper. But the production of rice paper is something that's been going on in China for probably thousands of years. And over those thousands of years, many different plants have been used to produce rice paper. Sometimes even rice has been used to make rice paper. But apparently you can take this pretty firm bark and through many different steps of processing, produce rice paper that is very flexible and fine textured. So really well suited to, both writing on and painting on. Sometimes the spent flower heads on plants are fairly attractive in the wintertime. This is the panicle Hydrangea Paniculata. And, they're getting a little bit shabby after heavy rains and such, but this is an older selection that is more typical of the wild type, where you have a limited number of these big sterile flowers, and then all these little dark gray fruits in here were produced by the fertile flowers. When you get things like limelight or some of those others, there's very few of these small fertile flowers, and it's mostly just these big sterile flowers. But these still make quite a good show in the winter and in the summertime. And with all the small fertile flowers that produce these fruit, they're really good plants for pollinators. But I guess today we're not talking about pollinators, but we're talking about plants of winter interest.
Is that one Brussels lace, Doug?
That sounds right.
Okay.
I think Brussels lace is from the Comtoot. I don't know how to pronounce it. The arboretum in Belgium that the De Belders owned. The De Belders introduced many witch hazels as well, but also Hydrangea Paniculata cultivars. This is a little bit more subtle than some of the plants with ornamental bark. We saw the common Zelkova over there, but this is a different species of Zelkova. This is Zelkova carpinifolia, which would mean foliage like carpinus, the ironwoods or hornbeams. And this is the common name is Caucasian elm from the Caucasus and Iran. You see the bark is peeling, and when the gray bark peels, it reveals this orangey gold underlayer of bark. So it's a real pretty subtle modeling effect. I love the fluted trunks as well. Okay. The branching on it is very, very delicate. These gray winter skies are the dark twigs of deciduous plants against the silvery sky is really beautiful. River birch is one of our native birches. It's a real common birch in the southeast. The majority of other birches are more typical of colder parts of the country. But Betula nigra is common in this area, especially in floodplains. It will tolerate periodic standing water. The bark is very attractive, very dramatic. Personally, I really like river birch. I think it's a better plant as a background plant rather than one you have to live with up close and personal. Because if the weather turns dry in summer, it'll start shedding its leaves and shed leaves for months, and then it drops a lot of little twigs, and you don't have to be right on top of it to see the to see the bark. So it could be a background plant if your yard is big enough where you can have background plants. But really, one of the most dramatically barked plants that you can grow. This is a fairly young plant. And this is a dwarf selection of the same species of birch, the river birch, Betula nigra. It's one with the cultivar name of Fox Valley and the trademark name of Little King. And you're saying it's not very dwarf. Well, yes, you're right. It's not very dwarf, but for probably the first 20 years or so, it did look much more like a large shrub. And it is, you know, maybe the height of the first river birch we looked at. So smaller growing, but not a tiny thing by any means. Though a river birch would most likely regrow if you cut it to the ground. So if you had this cultivar and it got too big, you could just probably cut it to the ground and start all over with a smaller plant again. This is one of our native azaleas. Our native azaleas are deciduous. You know, at the beginning of this program, I mentioned that evergreen was not a class of plants, just a characteristic. And most people know azaleas as evergreen selections, but azaleas can be either evergreen or deciduous, just like dogwoods and maples can be evergreen or deciduous depending on the species. And, you know, many decades ago, azaleas was actual name of a genus, but all the azaleas have been lumped in with the rhododendrons, so they're all rhododendrons. But some of them, these big terminal buds are the flower buds. These smaller lateral buds are vegetative ones, and this one isn't so pronounced, but some of them have really beautifully patterned buds in the wintertime. But I think also just the architecture of this is really pretty. I'm going to get back to that in a second. This one also has a lot of fruit on it, these seed pods. That's what these things are. They're still green, so they're not ripe. But notice how the growth habit is sort of swooping down. And then, you know, that was 2 years ago. It grew here. And then last year it grew this way. And then this growth was made the most recent growing season. But this real beautiful architecture. Cornus florida, or flowering dogwood, has that same sort of growth habit. And I like Cornus florida, but the feature I like best is its winter architecture, because it's much like this azalea where, you know, there's a certain rhythm and pattern to the way the branches are formed and held. You know, a subtle thing, you know, if you're only focused on brilliantly colored flowers, you miss these things that are in front of our eyes.
Did you mention the name of that one, Doug?
No. Do you want it?
Yeah.
Well, you know, I didn't mention the name because it's one of our native azaleas, and they're this time of year all fairly similar. It's Rhododendron austrinum.
So that's the yellow number 3?
It's yellow number 3.
Thank you.
Oh, and you know, this is Hydrangea macrophylla that is typically seen in the big blue mophead ones, but obviously this is a lace cap form. And, you know, we're just looking at, I'm sort of blocking the view of this pretty little spent flower heads. Terminal buds are nice and red. And, you know, one of the most common questions that public gardens and garden centers and master gardeners, when they're answering phones, get is, why are my hydrangeas not blooming? Well, if it's selection of Hydrangea macrophylla, and if you cut the stems back now, these big terminal buds have next summer's flower buds in there already. So if you cut them off, you won't have any flowers next year, unless it's one of those modern varieties that blooms on both old or new wood. But, you know, this is really subtle, but I think that's really beautiful this time of year. Okay. He's lost his mind, they're thinking. This is a coastal redwood, Sequoia sempervirens, that California native, the West Coast native. And probably the average form wouldn't do well here, but there are a number of selections that do well in the East. And this is actually Swarthmore hardy is the cultivar name. I guess either from the Scott Arboretum as part of Swarthmore College or just Swarthmore, Pennsylvania. And it's now maybe one of the tallest trees in the Arboretum, but has this very handsome, deep furrowed, what is the word I'm looking for? Furrowed bark. But I think also the birds and squirrels must strip the bark because it's clear that a lot of it has been sort of been pulled away. The bark is very spongy, but a beautiful aspect of it. This is a Japanese ironwood, Carpinus japonica, which has gorgeous leaves with really pronounced veins in the leaf. You might get, I don't think this is the time of year to be looking at the foliage, but you might get a sense of how pronounced the veins are in this dried up leaf, looking at the underside of it. But the leaves are gorgeous in the summertime. But just look at the beautiful little greenish buds, resting there all winter long, but holding the promise of next spring and next summer. And the very fine tracery of stems. This is the, it's not quite, well, it's the fruiting structure. It's all these bracts, and underneath the bracts would have been, I guess, the seeds were held. And a very close cousin of the carpinus, the ironwoods or musclewood or hornbeams, is the hop hornbeam, which is Australia. And the hop hornbeam is another small tree and has this same kind of structure. And you can see where it gets its name of hop hornbeam, because this looks very much like the cluster of bracts and fruit on hops that are used to flavor beer. Another tree native to Texas and, Texas, Florida to Illinois, it looked like, is the water elm. It's not a true elm. It's the leaf is elm-like, but it's a Planera aquatica, and bark is pretty striking, highlighted with some lichen growing on the bark, but nice peely bark. Topics, but a plant I like to point out because I wish they were more frequently grown are the little winter blooming ericas. It's close cousin to heather. Actually, the erica is known as heaths and heathers. The heathers are Calluna. This is in the genus Erica. And you need to provide it good drainage, not excessive drainage, just good drainage, and then it will last for years and bloom all winter long. This is a hybrid selection, Erica X Darliensis, and it's the cultivar White Perfection. White is a real typical color, also pink and, very dark pinks, almost red. It's a little evergreen shrub. Now the Callunas, the true heathers, the ones that are winter hardy, don't like our summers, and then many of the other species of Calluna are Mediterranean shrubs that don't survive our winter. But Erica, both Erica carnea and these hybrid ones are, very well suited to our climate. This little Sephora, as it's a small tree, but really, very dense little rounded habit to the branching structure, very finely branched. Contrast that to this is the same Zelkova we saw from the other side, but look how much brighter the twigs look with the sun shining on it. Again, the point I made with things like the flame willow, where if the sun is shining on it, it really brings out the color of the bark. But, now we're looking sort of at comparing the architecture, the Zelkova, which is sort of very vase-shaped and upright, and then this lovely little rounded habit of this Sephora. I'm going to step into the garden and get you the whole name of it. Well, and here's its label. And I'm calling it Sephora, which was the old name. Can you see this from there? The genus Sephora has been renamed and maybe divided, so this is no longer Sephora, but Styphnolobium affini, and the common name of Eve's necklace. It's a Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas native. I guess maybe the seeds or maybe the flowers are where it gets, well, some of these fruits are in long clusters. Maybe this is where it gets its common name of Eve's necklace with this chain of fruit. It is a legume, in the bean and pea family. So the flowers are pea-like, are similar to the flowers of peas. And in the legume family, some of our most important foods come from that family, but many members of the family are also poisonous. So I will not be eating this on camera today. And I wouldn't recommend trying it unless you did a little research first. I was thinking earlier today that this small tree or large shrub is actually evergreen, even though it's deciduous, because the stems are green year-round. This is the trifoliate orange. Up until recently, it was not in the same genus as the citrus. It was in the genus Pansaris, but taxonomists have recently decided that it's enough like the true citrus that it's now in the genus Citrus. So it's Citrus Trifoliata. Trifoliata because the leaves are trifoliate, sort of like a clover or an alfalfa leaf. And you can see a few fruit up high that are more typical size. I can't reach them too readily without getting permanently attached to the plant, but it is a very typical, these are sort of half size and sort of shriveled up. But it's a very typical citrus fruit. Whoops. And now it's filthy dirty. But the botanical term for this kind of fruit, it's actually a berry, because a berry has many small seeds dispersed in the flesh, like a blueberry does or a watermelon. But this is a specific type of berry called the Hesperidium, where it's divided into those sections that, so typical of a citrus. And being a wild species of citrus, there's more seeds than flesh inside the fruit, and it is fertile. We get carpets of seedlings underneath it. And despite being this particular cultivar with the contorted twigs rather than straight twigs, it comes true from seed. So these were, just a few highlights of what you might see in the garden if you open your eyes. Certainly look around your own garden, look around the woods around your house and neighbors' yards, and I think you'll see, even if it's not full of bloom this time of year, you will see, there's no end of really beautiful things in the garden. So I thank you for your time today, and happy gardening. Okay.
Well, thank you so much, Doug.
Sure.
We at least have one really good question in the chat that I wasn't able to ask or answer. Not that the other questions weren't good, but
I thought you were implying that all the rest were bad questions.
No. I changed it, so I'm not insulting anyone. I just thought it was a really good question, and I wouldn't mind knowing the answer. Marilyn was wondering if there's a purpose for exfoliating bark. Like, why do certain trees get rid of their bark like the crepe myrtle does, or the ones that you show like the sandalwood, whereas some trees keep it? I don't think I've ever read why.
Well, it's the same reason why snakes molt and insects molt.
So they can get bigger?
So they can get bigger.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah. You know, a snake's skin doesn't expand.
Yep.
So as the snake gets bigger, it has to shed the old skin so it can now be bigger. And the same thing is happening with the trunk. The old bark, if it's not completely shed, it at least develops furrows. So instead of being, like in solid bark, they sort of start splitting apart, or other things do it more dramatically, like the river birch or the blue sandalwood.
So the options are to crack or fall off, right?
Yeah.
or not to grow.
Yeah. So I think it's really just, for the same reason that a snake or insect molts, in order to get bigger.
I do think that was the only question in the chat that I was not able to answer. If anyone else has any questions, go ahead and please ask them. You can do it in the chat, or you can unmute yourself. It's up to you. Otherwise, we're done for the day.
Hey, Doug, somebody asked, how old does that Poncirus have to be before it bears fruit?
I didn't hear the question.
How quickly does the Poncirus bear fruit from a seed or a very young plant to maturity?
I do not know.
Marilyn, I don't know who asked that question, but thank you for doing that. I do have a seedling at home, and I don't remember how many years it took, but it produced fruit relatively quickly at home. It was just a matter of 3-4 years, if I'm not mistaken. It did not take long. Any more questions? And by the way,
Thank you.
We had the flying dragon at one of the recent plant sales, and those were definitely plants to produce fruit, weren't they?
Oh yeah, those were, a good 2, maybe almost 3 feet tall, and real husky.
I thought those were closer to 4 feet tall. But yeah, I think if you buy yourself a plant, it could probably produce fruit if it's in a 3-gallon container really quickly. But you're welcome. Thank you for joining us today. So glad you could be here with us. Someone did just ask, Rosemary asked, when is the plant sale? The spring plant sale is on the last Saturday in April. So that's coming up real soon. We are definitely looking forward to hosting Ralston Blooms again this year, which will include the plant sale. It'll include the 20th annual birdhouse competition. Third attempt for all of those programs. And so looking forward to that. But we do have a plant auction coming up real soon in February to go along with our winter symposium. So that's right around the corner. So you have that to look forward to as well. And otherwise, have a great day. It's quite lovely outside. Hope you have a couple of mums get outside in the garden. We certainly did today. Thank you for joining us. And thank you so much, Doug, for a great presentation. And thank you, Alexander and Carol, for helping out with the filming of today's program. Really appreciate your help today. Thanks, everyone. See you next week.